Clara, a resilient waitress at Maple and Pine Diner, silently endures a tough life, haunted by a past wildfire and struggling financially. One stormy night, her quiet kindness in offering a hungry stranger a meal incurs the wrath of her cruel boss, Roy. Clara faces paycheck deductions, slashed shifts, and isolation, her dignity seemingly crumbling. However, a mysterious business card left by the limping stranger hints at an unexpected twist. The next morning, the stranger returns, not as a desperate man, but with a powerful official poised to expose Roy's reign of injustice and revealing a surprising, life-altering connection to Clara's past. If Clara's story touched you or inspired you, please give it a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to life, reminding us that small gestures can leave the biggest footprints. The young waitress stood behind the counter, her posture still, her hands trembling slightly as they traced the edges of a weathered business card. It had been left behind 2 nights ago by a man who limped when he walked, a stranger whose quiet presence lingered long after he was gone. Each evening at the Maple and Pine Diner, Clara Matthews moved through her shift with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. To the patrons, she was just another friendly face in a green uniform. But beneath that uniform, pressed close to her skin, hung her father's dog tag on a fine silver chain. No one knew it was there, her only remaining keepsake after the wildfire that had reduced everything she once knew to ashes. For 5 years, Clara had rebuilt her life from that silence, never reaching out for help, never daring to hope for more than the steady rhythm of work and solitude, until the night a weary old man walked in, drenched from the rain, gripping a battered briefcase like it held the last pieces of his dignity. Without even realizing it, that man cracked open a door in Clara's soul, one she had kept shut tight for far too long. At 31, Clara had long ago mastered the art of being invisible. She moved through the world without drawing attention, always helpful, always polite, always on time, but rarely, if ever, truly seen. Night after night at the quiet corner diner nestled between a rundown gas station and a laundromat that had seen better days, Clara showed up in the same neatly pressed green uniform, her name stitched just above her heart. The silver chain around her neck would occasionally peek from beneath her collar, but no one ever asked about it. Still, she felt its weight constantly, a small, grounding reminder of the father she'd lost and the strength she clung to. Staff Sergeant James Matthews had died when Clara was 25. A year later, the fire came and swallowed what was left of her past. Their home, their memories, gone. But Clara didn't fall apart. She didn't cry for help or ask the world to feel sorry for her. Instead, she tied her apron back on, returned to the only place that offered routine and stability, and went to work. The Maple and Pine Diner wasn't much. Its once-red siding was faded and chipped. The neon sign above the door flickered when the wind hit just right. But it was familiar, predictable. It kept her moving. For 5 years straight, Clara worked the night shift, 6 nights a week without fail. Locals described her as dependable. Her boss, Roy Fenwick, called her replaceable. Clara, however, called it what it was: survival. Most of the people who sat at her tables barely glanced up from their plates. Truckers passing through, graveyard shift workers, lonely salesmen. They ordered coffee, eggs, maybe a slice of pie, and they left just as quickly as they came. Clara served them all with the same soft tone, the same calm manner, the same efficient movements. She never expected them to remember her name. She barely remembered theirs. Still, her quiet efficiency didn't make the math work. Her paycheck, even stretched thin, couldn't cover everything. Rent for her cramped studio downtown was due in 5 days, and the envelope on her counter at home held barely more than half the amount she needed. But on Tuesday night, Clara still showed up like she always did, lip balm tucked in her apron pocket, bobby pins keeping her hair in place, and that quiet, unshakable resolve carrying her through the door. The rain had begun just after 8 o'clock, soft at first, then falling in sheets that blurred the diner windows and danced across the parking lot in cold, chaotic patterns. A biting wind swept through whenever the door opened. Inside, the flicker of fluorescent lights hummed above, and the gentle clatter of dishes echoed through the near-empty room. It was a slow night. Clara moved with the muscle memory of years, refilling condiment bottles, wiping down booths, her footsteps light and unhurried. At exactly 8:42, the bell above the door rang. Clara glanced up, not expecting anything unusual, but she paused. A man stepped inside, slightly hunched, water dripping from the hem of his coat. He looked to be in his late 60s, maybe older, his gray hair plastered against his forehead. His coat was soaked through, heavy with rain. One hand gripped a worn cane, the other clutched a scuffed leather briefcase with the kind of protectiveness that came from having little else to hold on to. He moved slowly, dragging his right leg behind him with visible effort. Without hesitation, Clara crossed the room to greet him. "Evening," she said softly, offering a menu with a warmth that wasn't forced. "Can I get you something hot to drink?" The man hesitated, his eyes drifting to the prices on the menu. "Just coffee," he said, voice low and guarded. "Black, please." Clara noticed the tremble in his hands. It wasn't age that caused it, but hunger. She had seen that look before, too many times lately. She glanced back toward the kitchen, then leaned in slightly. "Kitchen made a mistake earlier," she said gently. "We've got an extra plate of the special tonight. Shepherd's pie, still warm. Wouldn't want it to go to waste. Want me to bring it out?" He looked as if he might refuse. His mouth opened, then closed again, his jaw tightening as though swallowing pride. After a beat, he gave a barely noticeable nod. "Thank you," he murmured. Clara returned with the plate and a steaming cup of coffee, setting them down in front of him without fanfare. She didn't linger or make conversation, just offered a small, genuine smile, and something in the way she looked at him seemed to tell him that he wasn't alone. And for the first time since stepping into the diner, the man who had barely met anyone's gaze finally looked up. He stepped inside, eyes scanning until they landed on hers. For a fleeting second, their gazes met. In his face, worn and weary, there was a trace of something that reached deeper than exhaustion. Gratitude. A flicker of hope. Clara turned away before the weight of the moment could fully settle in, before Roy could notice, but she wasn't fast enough. Roy Fenwick, the manager of the diner, had been watching through the office window behind the counter, his gaze sharp and suspicious. The instant the man picked up his fork, Roy pushed through the swinging kitchen door, voice booming with indignation. "What the hell is this, Matthews?" he snapped. "This isn't a charity. We're not running a damn soup kitchen." Clara didn't flinch. She stood steady, meeting Roy's anger with calm. "I told you, it was a kitchen error," she replied, voice even. Roy jabbed a thick finger at her chest. "Then it comes out of your paycheck." The man at the table stirred, trying to speak up, to push the plate away. Clara reached out with a quiet grace, resting her hand gently on the edge of the table in front of him. "Please eat," she said softly, never taking her eyes off Roy. Roy curled his lip into a sneer. "Pull this again and you're done. I don't care how many years you've worked here." With that, he turned and stormed back into his office, the door slamming shut like a final gavel. The man took a bite, slow, careful, like each chew had to last. Clara, heart racing, busied herself with wiping down the coffee station. Her face was flushed, not with fear, but with something sharper. Shame, not for herself, but for the scene that had just played out in front of someone who hadn't asked for anything except a little decency. As she reached for the sugar packets, her fingers brushed the thin chain around her neck. Her lips moved in a barely audible whisper. "Still standing, Dad." She'd weathered worse storms than this, and her gut told her the night was far from done. When her shift finally ended and she stepped outside, the rain had eased to a light mist, but the cold had sunk in deep, coiling through her bones. She zipped her coat up to her chin and walked home, mind tangled with thoughts as thick as the steam curling up from the sewer grates. The image of the older man lingered with her, the way he had clutched his weathered leather briefcase like it contained the last pieces of his life, how he had eaten as if each bite needed to be rationed. There was hunger in him, yes, but something more stayed with her. The look he'd given her. Gratitude, certainly, but not just that. Recognition, maybe. A kind of quiet understanding, like he'd seen something familiar in her silence. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at Clara that way. Her apartment was as cold as the street. The old building's heat hadn't kicked in, temperamental as always. She peeled off her damp socks and sat on the edge of her bed. Her fingers fumbled with the envelope labeled rent. Inside, $412. That was all she had left after groceries, after bills, after the modest savings left from her father's memorial fund. 700. That's what she needed by Friday. No rounding, no wishful thinking. The numbers were what they were. She stared at her lap. Her hands were still trembling, not from the cold, but from everything else. The next morning, Clara arrived 15 minutes early, as always. The diner smelled like burnt bacon and bleach, comforting and stale all at once. She tied her apron, pulled her hair into a neat ponytail, and tried to shake off the heaviness of the night before. But Roy hadn't forgotten. "Matthews," he barked from behind the counter. "You're in Section 3 now." Clara blinked. Section 3, the worst part of the floor. 2 booths near the restrooms and a table tucked in the corner with a wobbly leg. Tips there were a fraction of what she usually earned. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Oh, and your hours? They're cut. We're overstaffed this week." His smirk didn't hide the sting in his words. She nodded once, no argument, just grabbed her notepad and walked away. Carl, Roy's smug nephew and self-proclaimed assistant manager, snickered from behind the soda machine. "Careful, Clara," he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Keep handing out free meals, and every homeless guy in the county will be lined up at the door." Maggie, the hostess who usually joked with Clara during the morning lull, suddenly had her eyes glued to her clipboard. Not even a glance in Clara's direction. The cold returned, but it wasn't from the outside this time. It was that creeping kind of cold. Loneliness. The isolation that sets in when kindness turns you into a liability. When even your allies shrink away. The kitchen crew, who used to slip her an extra dinner roll or sneak her a hot side of fries during her break, now passed her the smallest, coldest plates with tight lips and furtive glances toward Roy's office window. Fear spreads fast, and Roy had chosen Clara to be the warning, the example, and her shift hadn't even really begun. Clara sat alone in the staff room during her break, her legs tucked beneath her, as if trying to take up less space in a world that kept shrinking around her. The moment felt heavier than usual. She pulled out her phone and opened the calculator app, not to check a recipe or count tips like she used to, but to face the math that had been quietly gnawing at her. She punched in her newly reduced hours, then subtracted the bus fare, the groceries she couldn't skimp on, and that dental bill that had haunted her inbox for months. The total stared back at her like a verdict. She wasn't going to make it. She hadn't asked for pity. She didn't need applause. She hadn't even expected a thank you. All she wanted was to know that when a man walked into the diner soaked and starving, she didn't let him leave that way. But dignity, it seemed, didn't pay the bills. Earlier that afternoon, during a lull in service, she had been carrying a tray of clean glasses back toward the kitchen. She moved quickly, always trying to stay one step ahead of the next task. Her foot slid slightly on a damp patch of tile. She caught herself, but the tray tilted. One glass slipped on, hit the ground, and shattered with a sharp crash that silenced the room. Roy appeared almost instantly, drawn by the sound like a vulture to a carcass. 3 customers sat at the bar, still watching as he barked. "That's coming out of your paycheck, too." Clara dropped to her knees, gathering the shards with shaking hands. Her voice was low, nearly swallowed. "It was an accident." "Accidents cost money," Roy snapped. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before giving away my inventory like it's Halloween candy." Clara felt her face flush, not with shame, but with something deeper and rawer: injustice. She had poured herself into this place, covered shifts no one else wanted, stayed late without complaint, shown up sick and sore and exhausted. She had endured every condescending word, every raised voice, every petty humiliation. But this broken glass glinting in the harsh fluorescent light, felt like the final fracture in her self-respect, the last straw. That night, when the last customer left and the chairs were flipped onto tables, Roy disappeared into his office without a word. Clara silently locked the front door, mopped the floor where the glass had broken, wiped down each vinyl booth with mechanical precision. She didn't cry. She didn't even sigh. She just moved through it all, each motion carrying a little more weight than the last. When she reached the booth where the limping man had sat earlier, she paused. Something small caught her eye near the edge of the table, flat, rectangular, and slightly worn. A business card. She picked it up gently, as if it might disappear at her touch. Jonathan Pierce, Essor, Veteran Advocacy and Labor Rights, Albany, NY. She stared at it for a long time before slipping it into her pocket. The card's corners were softened, as though it had been carried for years. She couldn't say why he left it. Maybe he forgot. Maybe it was his way of saying thank you. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd meant to leave it. Clara didn't believe in omens, not really, but she did believe in people. People who showed up drenched and limping and still found a way to offer something back. Hope, maybe, in a form you wouldn't recognize right away. The next morning, the Maple and Pine Diner woke under a thin veil of pale sunlight, muted through the lingering clouds of last night's storm. Clara, as always, arrived before the others, but something immediately felt off. A sleek black sedan was parked out front, angled awkwardly across two gravel spots. Its glossy exterior and polished chrome didn't belong among the dented pickups and sun-faded wagons that usually filled the lot. The car looked like it had never even heard of this part of town. Clara hesitated a beat before pushing through the diner's glass door. Inside, everything looked exactly as it always did. Red vinyl booths, the smell of scorched coffee hanging stubbornly in the air, and the familiar flicker of the old light above the pastry case. But at the counter, sipping from one of their chip mugs, was the limping man. He looked different now, drawing clean-shaven, his wool coat neatly buttoned over pressed slacks. His hair was combed back, and the briefcase he once clung to was resting casually at his feet. He no longer looked like a man in freefall. He looked like someone who'd remembered who he was. And he wasn't alone. Seated beside him was a woman in her 50s, tall and composed, radiating quiet command. She wore a navy blazer tailored to perfection, a crisp shirt beneath it, and a pen clipped with a surgical precision to her breast pocket. Everything about her, the sharp line of her collar, the straightness of her posture, spoke of confidence and authority. She didn't belong in this diner, not by appearances. But she sat there as if she had been coming here for years. Clara froze just inside the door. The woman turned, met her eyes, and rose with a smooth, practiced grace. "Miss Matthews?" she asked. Clara nodded slowly, her hands reflexively tightening around the apron strap at her waist. The limping man stood too and extended a hand. "I don't believe I properly introduced myself the other night," he said, voice even and calm. "Jonathan Pierce." Clara reached out and shook his hand cautiously. I got your card." "I hoped you would," he said, smiling gently. Before Clara could ask anything else, Roy burst out from the back, stopping short as he took in the unexpected scene unfolding at his counter. His eyes darted from Clara to the sharply dressed woman, then to Jonathan. "You can't—" Roy had just opened his mouth to protest, something along the lines of, "You can't just barge in," but he never got the chance to finish. The woman in the doorway lifted a hand with quiet authority, and it was enough to shut him up. "Mr. Roy Fenwick," she said, her tone crisp and unwavering. Roy blinked in surprise. "Yes?" "My name is Eleanor Blake. I represent the New York State Bar's Division of Labor Ethics. Based on the information we've reviewed, your treatment of employees appears to violate multiple labor statutes under state law." The words struck the room like a lightning bolt. The entire diner froze in place. Not a single fork clinked, not a breath stirred. Even Carl, halfway through a sip of his latte, froze with the cup inches from his mouth. Clara stood stiffly behind the counter, too stunned to react. Her ears buzzed like they were underwater. Then Jonathan stepped forward, calm and measured, and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a folder, worn but neatly organized, and placed it on the counter with quiet resolve. 15 years ago, he began, his voice carrying through the diner with an even strength. "I was a partner at a law firm that specialized in veterans' rights. Then a car accident cost me my mobility, and with it, my career. The years that followed were difficult. I spent them searching for a new sense of purpose. That search led me here." He paused and reached back into the folder, pulling out a faded, slightly crumpled photograph. With reverence, he slid it across the counter to Clara. Her fingers brushed the edge as she looked down at the image. There, in that snapshot of another time, was a younger Jonathan dressed in full military uniform. Standing beside him was a man in fatigues, her father, and a teenage girl. Her. Memories rushed back with vivid clarity. The wildfire, the evacuation, the heavy smoke curling around military trucks. The man who had carried her father's medical files and promised they would be safe. "That was you," she murmured, voice catching on the edge of memory. "I never forgot," Jonathan said softly. "Your father spoke of your strength, your resilience. You were what, 16, 17 then?" She nodded faintly, barely breathing. "When I saw your name tag," he continued, "and then watched you give your own meal to someone like me, even knowing it could cost you your job, I realized I had found someone I once helped and who now needed help herself." Behind the counter, Roy was trying to find words, flustered and cornered. But Eleanor cut in again, her voice now carrying the cold weight of legal certainty. "We've already gathered documentation of multiple violations, unauthorized paycheck deductions, retaliatory shift assignments, and a clear pattern of intimidation. If these are confirmed, they could result in substantial penalties, including but not limited to the revocation of your business license." Carl suddenly rose from his seat in a nearby booth, phone in hand. His voice was quieter than usual, but it carried. "I recorded everything yesterday, the part where you said you'd deduct the broken glass from her paycheck. I also have screenshots of her schedule. Her hours got cut right after that." Roy turned on him, eyes blazing. "You little—" "I'm not going down with you," Carl muttered, already backing away. Jonathan stepped forward and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "I may be retired, Miss Matthews," he said, "but I still remember how to fight for those who deserve to be defended." Clara stared again at the photograph. Her fingertips brushed over her father's dog tag that still hung beneath her collar, warm from her skin. The past and present began to align like overlapping negatives in an old camera, finally snapping into focus. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't planned any of it. All she had done was try to do the right thing. And yet, here it was, something far larger than her, set into motion by a quiet act of kindness and a plate of shepherd's pie. By midday, the Maple and Pine Diner had more foot traffic than it had seen in years. But nobody was there for pancakes. Word had gotten out fast. Some came out of sheer curiosity. Others showed up because they'd heard that something was finally happening. Something long overdue. Something just. Clara stood behind the counter, not taking orders, not refilling coffee, just standing, as Jonathan Pierce and Eleanor Blake spread folders open across one of the tables. The pages, filled with statements, documents, and screenshots, were on full display for everyone, staff and patrons alike. Roy had vanished into his office, blinds drawn tight. But through the slats, everyone could still see him pacing like a trapped animal, sweat collecting at his temples as he barked into his phone in hushed, desperate tones. "I've been here for 3 years," said Maggie, the hostess, her voice trembling as she spoke to one of the young legal aides who had arrived from Albany to help gather testimony. "Clara trained me on my first day," she went on, her voice gaining strength. "She's the reason I learned how to run the register. She even lent me money for bottles when I didn't have enough to get home." The aide nodded gently, her tone encouraging. "Did you witness any unfair treatment from management?" Maggie hesitated for just a breath. She paused for a second, then nodded silently. This woman had taken over every single shift Clara had missed when her daughter was sick. Never once did she complain, not even when Roy had slashed her health benefits the previous winter, without warning or explanation. The legal assistant jotted that detail down carefully. A few booths away, a burly truck driver, one who faithfully showed up every Thursday morning, pushed himself to his feet. He didn't say a word. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled $20 bill from his wallet, walked up to the counter and slipped it into a tip jar Clara hadn't noticed before. It had clearly been added recently. A handwritten note was taped to the front in haste. It read, "For Clara." One by one, more people began to stand. A young mother struggling to corral 2 toddlers, an elderly man using a cane, a teenage boy still wearing his headphones. People who had barely spoken to Clara in all the years she'd served them now stood patiently in line, quietly contributing whatever they could, some with bills, others with coins, a few with envelopes. When the first jar filled, someone found another. And when that one filled, they brought out a third. "For 5 years, you brought me breakfast," an older woman said through tears as she placed her offering into the jar. After my husband passed, you were the only one who remembered exactly how I take my tea. You think we didn't notice you? We noticed, Clara. Clara's hands trembled as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Everything, the booths, the counter, the greasy windows, the creaking floor, suddenly felt different. The walls of the old diner, worn and familiar, seemed to pulse with something new, something alive. It wasn't just gratitude, it was justice. Even the kitchen staff began to file out, one after another. Carlos, who barely spoke more than a few words of English and always kept to himself, removed his apron and walked up to Eleanor with surprising resolve. Roy, he take money from our paychecks, he said quietly, each word measured but firm. He say, if we complain, we lose job. Or worse, he call immigration. Eleanor's expression went cold, her tone sharp. That's wage theft and coercion, she stated plainly, and it's a felony. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the diner no longer felt like a greasy spoon. It felt like a courtroom. Customers had become witnesses, employees, plaintiffs. Clara stood at the center of it all, silent, wide-eyed, unsure if she was caught in a dream or being swept away by a tidal wave she hadn't seen coming. And just when she thought she couldn't possibly take in one more thing, the bell over the door jingled once again. A tall man in an army dress uniform stepped into the diner, his presence immediately silencing the room. He scanned the space. Sarah? He called. Clara turned. It was Jason, her brother. She hadn't laid eyes on him in almost 2 years. He looked leaner now, his face sharpened by deployments and experience. But when their eyes met, the same boyish grin broke through, unchanged by time. Without a second's hesitation, she ran into his arms, and they held each other tightly as the diner erupted in applause. Jonathan tracked me down, Jason said as they pulled apart. Why didn't you tell me things were this bad? Clara struggled to answer, emotion clogging her throat. I didn't want to worry you, she managed softly. You were deployed. I figured I'd find a way to handle it. You don't have to anymore, Jason said gently. Jonathan stepped forward, standing beside Eleanor. Miss Matthews, he began, we've identified 47 separate violations of labor law in this establishment. That number is likely to increase. Clara blinked, stunned. We're preparing to file a class action lawsuit, Eleanor added, her voice crisp. But we've also spoken to the property owner. Clara turned quickly. Wait, she said. That caught her attention. Just then, Roy Fenwick emerged from his office at last. His shoulders slumped, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something like shame. He was flanked by 2 attorneys. We've reached a settlement, Eleanor announced. Mr. Fenwick has agreed to sell his business interest in exchange for leniency and to avoid criminal prosecution. Clara looked confused. She searched Jonathan's face for clarity. With the settlement being filed, Jonathan explained, you could take over the lease if you want to. Clara slowly shook her head, overwhelmed. I'm not a business owner, she said softly. I'm just a waitress. A dozen voices around the diner spoke at once. You're much more than that. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara believed them. That afternoon, long after the last customer had trickled out and the applause had faded into memory, Clara sat alone at the counter. Her apron still bore traces of flour, and her name tag sat slightly askew. The only sound left in the room was the low hum of the ancient refrigerator, humming steadily like an old companion who refused to leave her side. In her hand she held the keys, cold and metallic, pressing heavily into her palm. They were heavier than she'd imagined they would be. Earlier that day, under the watchful eyes of lawyers and witnesses, Roy Fenwick had signed the papers. He had turned in the final paperwork. Jail wasn't in his future, but neither was pride. The moment he handed the folder to Eleanor and slipped out through the back door, not a single person came after him. His time at Maple and Pine didn't end in dramatic fashion. There was no outburst, no farewell, no applause. Just a quiet, inevitable conclusion. That chapter had closed. The diner, from that moment forward, belonged to Clara. She hadn't asked for it. She never would have. But somewhere deep inside her, something unshakable told her this was more than just justice being served. It was healing, something being set right. In the office, her office now, she noticed a small wooden nameplate that had always rested on the desk. Roy's name, etched beside the word manager, stared back at her. She studied it for a long, thoughtful minute before gently setting it aside. In its place, she laid down a simple, handwritten card. Nothing fancy, just a message that mattered, everyone welcome. When she walked back into the dining area, she was surprised to see she wasn't alone. A small girl, probably no older than 6, stood near her family's usual booth, clutching a folded piece of paper in her tiny hands. Her parents lingered a few steps away, watching her with quiet encouragement. The girl stepped forward, placed the paper next to Clara's half-drunk coffee, and leaned in close. "My mommy says you are a hero," she whispered, then turned and darted away before Clara could say a word. Clara unfolded the paper gently. Inside was an origami crane, carefully shaped from a placemat. The corners were smudged with syrup and traces of crayon, small signs of play and breakfast. But it was flawless in the way that only something made by a child's hands can be. She closed her eyes for a moment, not overwhelmed by praise or attention, but by the quiet power of being seen. The days that followed unfolded like a dream. Jonathan Pierce stayed in town longer than he had planned, offering his knowledge and steady presence as Clara took her first uncertain steps into ownership. Eleanor made sure she wasn't left navigating alone. She connected Clara with a pro bono legal team that specialized in business transitions and protecting worker rights. One by one, former employees, people who had once been too afraid or too uncertain to speak up, began to return. They didn't come back with bitterness or baggage. They brought help, encouragement, and unwavering loyalty. The physical space of the diner didn't change, but the air inside it did. There was a new warmth. The lighting felt cozier, the music softer. Conversations stretched longer, and laughter lingered like it had finally found a place to stay. Near the entrance, a new community board had been installed. Neighbors could post anything from offers to requests, a ride to a doctor's appointment, leftover coats, tutoring sessions for kids. Beneath the windows, a small bookshelf filled with donated novels appeared, inviting people to take a book, leave a book, or just sit and read. One booth in the back, never officially labeled but understood by all, became the veterans table. No one sat there alone. And Clara, she didn't shed her apron. She didn't stop pouring coffee or cleaning tables. She worked just like she always had. But something in her had shifted, subtly, deeply. She walked a little taller now. She spoke with clarity. She listened more intently, like she understood the weight behind people's words. And people noticed. Maybe that was the whole point. It's not always some grand, sweeping act that reshapes a life. Sometimes it's a small decision in the thick of chaos, a hot plate of food placed in front of someone who needed it, a refusal to turn away when silence would have been easier, a choice to stand up for someone too exhausted to stand on their own. That rainy night had changed everything. Not because Clara had been hoping for change, but precisely because she hadn't been. Her actions weren't calculated. They were born from instinct, decency, and the long memory of who she was raised to be. And in that moment, she reminded an entire town of what quiet courage and steady grace truly look like. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills and the neon sign out front hummed to life for the dinner shift, Clara stood near the entrance, watching families walk in and take their places. Her fingers found the familiar dog tag resting against her collarbone, her father's, and she smiled softly. "Still standing, Dad. Still standing." In a world that seems to rush past itself, where kindness is often mistaken for weakness and decency treated like a luxury, Clara's story offers a different kind of truth. You don't need wealth, celebrity, or influence to make an impact. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, to hold onto integrity when fear tries to pull it away. For older generations watching her story unfold, many may see their own reflection. Decades of hard work under difficult bosses, loyalty that went unrecognized, quiet acts of generosity that were never repaid. Clara carries that legacy forward. She stands as proof that character matters, that dignity isn't outdated, that compassion hasn't disappeared, and that standing up quietly, steadily, again and again, is still one of the most powerful things a person can do. Even the smallest actions, no matter who you are or where you stand, have the power to alter the course of an entire community. Clara's story is a reflection of that truth, not through grand speeches or sweeping heroism, but through the quiet strength of doing what's right, even when it's hard. Her experience also offers more than just a tale. It invites each of us to reflect. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Have you ever found yourself standing alone, only to discover that someone, somewhere, was standing quietly with you? Have you witnessed a moment where one seemingly insignificant choice turned into something deeply meaningful? These are the stories that live beyond the page. They shape us, stay with us, and whisper to others that courage can be quiet, and change doesn't always look like a revolution. It might look like a single person refusing to stay silent. If Clara's journey moved you, if it reminded you of someone you admire, or simply made you pause and think, we invite you to carry it forward. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your own moment of bravery or grace, because we're listening, and maybe someone else out there needs to hear your story too. Thank you for being here. If this story left a mark on your heart, please show your support with a like, pass it on to a friend, or subscribe so we can continue bringing real, heartfelt stories like Clara's to light. Because the smallest acts, those simple gestures made with care, can echo farther than we ever expect. In stories like Clara's, they don't just offer hope, they remind us of the quiet, enduring strength of humanity.